It is beyond dispute that we are, in the words of one of tonight's distinguished panelists, awash in a sea of geographic ignorance. I'm not trying to be mean here, but seeing the YouTube video of the Miss Teen USA pageant contestants' answer to the question, why can't 1/5 of Americans locate the US on a world map, caused me great pain. Her answer, if you were somehow lucky enough to miss the video, was, I believe personally that Americans are unable to do so because some people out there in our nation don't have maps. But this is no laughing matter. It is not just our beauty contestants who have problems. It's the very people who are making the decisions about our world that are geographically myopic. It now seems obvious that the very smart and serious leaders who planned the invasion and occupation of Iraq had little notion that the nation awkwardly drawn on a map by Winston Churchill and others 80 years ago is divided into 3 distinct ethnic regions. We've been bombarded by comparisons between the reconstruction of Iraq, which is riven with internal ethnic, religious, and political complexities, and the successful programs accomplished in post-World War II Germany and Japan, 2 countries that I think we can agree are fairly cohesive nations. The fact of the matter is the U.S. is the only country with significant international and political influence where it is possible to go from kindergarten through university without a single basic course in geography. You couldn't take one at my alma mater, Columbia University in New York City, which abolished its geography department years ago. But there seems to be a renaissance taking place. I'm not sure if it's because educators are taking note of geographical ignorance and reconstituting geography classes and programs, or that kids actually like playing with Google Earth or their new GPS systems. The fact of the matter is geography and geographic information systems are today affecting public policy as never before. Tonight's panel will try to explain why and how. By the way, this is nothing new. In 1854, John Snow depicted a cholera outbreak in London using points on a map representing individual cases. By using the geographical method, Snow was able to identify a contaminated pump as the source of the disease. Today, new mapping technologies routinely alter boundary and border disputes in places like Kashmir or the former Yugoslavia, and it has been reported that citizens of Baghdad use Google Earth to avoid dangerous areas of the city. How can geographic awareness change public opinion, or alter the course of war and peace, or help us preserve the environment? These are some questions I hope we can get at in tonight's program. Starting from stage right to left, Brian McClendon is an engineering director at Google, overseeing geo products including Google Earth, Google Maps, SketchUp, and Street View. He joined Google in 2004 after the acquisition of Keyhole Corporation, where he was VP of engineering and a member of the board of directors. Prior to Keyhole, which I'm sure you've seen on TV a million times, he was a founder at Intrinsic Graphics, an engineering director at the At Home Network, and spent 8 years in Silicon Graphics developing high-end workstation 3D graphic subsystems like GT, GTX, Reality Engine, and Infinite Reality. McClendon is also known, as I'm sure many of you know, as the man who made Lawrence the center of the earth. Because if you boot up the program on a PC, I learned tonight, gaze at the big blue marble, like view of our planet and zoom in as far as you can go, you end up just across Bob Billings Parkway at the Meadowbrook Apartments where Brian grew up. Thank you. He attended KU where he received a BS of Electrical Engineering in 1986. He currently resides in Silicon Valley. Moving directly to Brian's left, Alexander B. Murphy is Professor of Geography at the University of Oregon, where he also holds the James F. and Shirley K. Rippey Chair in Liberal Arts and Sciences. He specializes in cultural and political geography with a regional emphasis on Europe. Professor Murphy is a past president of the Association of American Geographers, a vice president of the American Geographical Society, and an editor of both Progress in Human Geography and Eurasian Geography and Economics. In the late 90s, he chaired the national committee that oversaw the addition of geography to the College Board's AP program. Professor Murphy is the author of more than 70 articles and several books, including The Regional Dynamics of Language Differentiation in Belgium, Cultural Encounters with the Environment, and Human Geography, Culture, Society, and Space. He's the recipient of numerous grants and awards, including a Fulbright Hays and a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Professor Murphy holds bachelor's degrees in archaeology from Yale, maybe because he couldn't major in geography at Yale either, a law degree from Columbia, and a PhD in geography from the University of Chicago. Next, boy, these are impressive people. Jerry Dobson is professor of geography here at KU and since 2002 the president of the American Geographical Society, and since 2004 a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. Before coming to Kansas, he served as a distinguished research and development staff member at Oak Ridge National Laboratory and president of the University Consortium for Geographic Information Science. He's the author of numerous articles and presentations and the recipient of major grants from several departments, including Department of Energy, the NSF, federal agencies including the DoD, State, Interior, and the EPA. His degrees are from the University of Tennessee, PhD, and the University of Georgia, master's. Perhaps most important, Dobson is a passionate evangelist for geography and geographical thinking as a way to make the world a better place. He has been instrumental in putting this panel together. Moderating this evening is my friend and Lawrence icon, Greg Hurd. Hurd is an AP Managing Editors, Telly, MIDI, and Mature Media award-winning producer who, as many of you know, hosts Free State Studios' River City Weekly, which I just found out has aired more than 250 different programs. He's recently become something of a movie mogul, producing the just-wrapped film The Only Good Indian, starring Wes Studi, and Bunker Hill, a collaboration with Kevin Wilmot, starring James McDaniel and Saeed Jaffrey, which is currently in post-production. Thank you for doing the heavy lifting, Greg. I turn it over to you.
Thank
Welcome.
you. Thank you, Jonathan. It looks like we may need to use GPS to find out the farthest people away in here. This is an amazing crowd. Thank you all for being here. We wanted to start out with brief video presentations by each of our panelists, and we'd begin with Brian McClendon. Which Brian?
So I thought before I do the video, I'd talk a little bit about...
It is turned on. Got it turned on?
No, that would do it, yeah. Okay, much better. I would start out with introducing a little bit about what Google Earth is and how it came to be. Working at Silicon Graphics in the mid-90s, we had very expensive hardware, and our goal was to be able to render 3D graphics faster than anyone else. One of the applications that many customers had asked for, some military, some government, some actually entertainment, was to render the Earth. And we invented a hardware technology that allowed for smooth animation of imagery from outer space resolution all the way down to very high resolution aerial photographs. That demo is called Space to Face, and it successfully sold $1 billion worth of hardware, but only to very rich customers. At Intrinsic Graphics, we invented a software application to do the same thing, but do it in a PC graphics card that you might have at home. Around 1999, not many people had it, but we spun out a company in 2001 called Keyhole, and Keyhole was named after a military satellite family called K series, but other than that has really no relation to it. Business model was to provide this application to consumers. We actually wanted to get the name Earth.com, but during the year of 2000, there was really no hope. Luckily, we were not a .com company, and we were able to produce something that was different. Keyhole is a downloadable software application. It's different from your sort of web program or web interface you might see. You had to install it on your computer, but once you did that, you got something that was significantly better than the MapQuest maps of the day. In 2003, CNN started to use Keyhole very heavily on air, and that really made the company. We were well known, we got a lot of revenue, and people at a company called Google developed some interest in us. And in 2004, we were acquired, and the first act that Larry and Sergey said is make it free. So we made Google Earth free in in May of 2005. And since then, it has been downloaded over 250 million times, which amounts to approximately 1/4 of all internet users on the planet. So people are familiar with it, and that's a very good thing. But what's interesting is that what we've produced is a large imagery database with labels and borders and terrain data, but the most interesting data is coming from outside. from third parties. Consumers who like to, show where they were born or show or things like that. Or professionals who had data, in GIS systems that they'd wanted to share, geographers in particular, who weren't able to communicate with the public, the things that they were able to show perhaps in technical presentations. And so Google Earth has become a vehicle for presenting third-party data to the consumer yourself. We also have Google Maps, which is a more simple web-based version, and we acquired SketchUp to make 3D buildings in Earth. So if you've ever wanted to put your own house in Google Earth, you can do it for free with a bit of work. So I thought I would start the demo here with looking at both the Dole Institute and also the Leeds Center. And for those who don't know what Meadowbrook looks like from above, it's right there. And it's grown much bigger than it was when I was there. But that's just one thing that you can do. Third-party data. This is data that was available in some form, either in lists and tables or compiled. A person named McClendon Butler, who is an editor for Nature magazine, decided to bring all of the data associated with the avian flu into one place, and in particular to map it on Google Earth. And what he was able to do was to count not just the location, but the number of birds affected, the number of humans affected, and then plot this over time. And so what you see here is a sequence from 2004 to about early 2007 now of the spread of the avian flu. And as you can see, actually, it's faded out as we approach the end of the cycle. There's much less this year than there was in 2004. I don't think it's cured, but it's an interesting visualization. But you can also then carry this globe over and see it across the rest of the world. But the two biggest areas are Southeast Asia and later in the sequence, actually, in Europe. Well, we have to wait for it here. And so there you get a sense of how the data is propagating. And all of this is an annotation on a 3D map. And each one of these dots, if you stop to click on it, will give you detailed information about exactly that event and specific about the time it happened. So this is a very much easier to understand version of the data than was available in spreadsheets and in papers that were written at the time. And more importantly, Mr. Butler has kept it up to date. And if you go load this file today, you'll see much more modern data than when he published his articles in Nature magazine in February 2006. The second area that has shown some interesting effects with Google Earth is Bahrain. It's a small country in the Middle East, and they're actually a very well-connected country. Many of the people are on the internet. But when Google Earth became popular in Bahrain, it turned out that they discovered that their towns that they were living in, the Shia were actually the largest population, were very dense and typical lower income Middle Eastern town. But right next door, where the vast majority of the Bahrain money lives, were these palaces, this being an example. And Bahrain actually blocked access to Google Earth for several weeks. And so in the grand scheme of the internet, which is known to route around any problems, the internet was managed to route around censorship as well. And this PDF file, which could not be blocked because it wasn't really Google Earth, was created by some of the people who wanted this message out. And this is 45 pages of very sort of explicit demonstrations of the differences between the haves and the have-not in Bahrain. And this occurred right before the 2006 elections, which were still somewhat symbolic, but the elections actually had a strong message that the Shia and Sunni Islamists got much more votes than the government supporters before them. So I don't think things have turned around because the royal family still runs Bahrain, but the message is clear. So.
Thank you, Brian. Alec, would you care to share?
Great. It's wonderful to see everyone here. I'm going to broaden the terrain a little bit. One of the wonderful things about Google Earth is that it is liberating the geographical imagination of many Americans, I think. It's something we critically need to do, because when you say the word geography to most people, what does it connote? the long list of what's the capital of Kansas now? You know, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, it usually connotes something that's a list of memorization facts about the world. Now, it's actually enormously useful to know some facts about the world. I tell my students, you know, it's very helpful if I stand up, mention Brazil, and not have an image of Central Asia come thundering to the fore in your minds. But that, of course, if that's the beginning and end of geography, geography would be about as important and as exciting as learning a bunch of dates would be if you were trying to convey what history was about. And I think we've got a pretty interesting and fundamental challenge right now in the United States because we have marginalized geography to the point where most people don't even know what to ask of it, what to expect of it. So, you know, the map that I am just putting up on the screen here is, I think, the typical map that somebody would say, that's the map you need to know and understand to be geographically literate. And many of our surveys that you read about in the newspapers that show some appalling number of San Antonio high school students can't find Mexico on a map, you know the ones I'm talking about, tend to reinforce this notion. And again, of course, it's useful to have some sense of how the world is organized and how it's put together. And in fact, it's even nice when the media gets this sort of thing right. This was from a CNN broadcast shortly after 9/11. They were talking about terrorist cells in Berlin. Fascinating story, but they didn't comment on the fact that Switzerland had taken over the Czech Republic. So I'm all in favor of getting these things right. But what does this have to do really with, I mean, to memorize a bunch of places on a map is useful. But what does it really have to do with the issues of the day, with politics, with issues of war and peace? And I would say a whole lot if you can enrich your understanding of geography and your sense of what geography can do, as just a couple of examples Brian gave us, help us to understand. Take something such as a concept which is battered around a lot these days, the Islamic world. You can pull a map like this off the web. The Islamic world, what is that? What does that mean? How do we use that concept? How do we understand that concept? The fact that it is used in a rather unthoughtful way is suggested even by sort of geopolitical models that you'll sometimes see out there. Look at Islam over there on the far right-hand side of the diagram. You know, there's Islam, there's the Islamic world. Well, when you frame a problem in terms of the Islamic world, you understand certain things and you hide other things. And I'm not saying all problems can't be understood without looking at multiple scales, but this is a particular framing that actually has, I would argue, been a fairly problematic one in terms of a number of understandings that we've tried to develop. It has fundamentally shielded us from thinking carefully about divisions within the Islamic world and some of the kinds of ethnic and political sorts of fragmentations that are actually of some significance. To try to illustrate what geography in this richer sense might mean for issues of conflict and peace, I want to just take very briefly, 30 seconds on each, 4 conflicts that have at least been a part of my life. And it's enormously heartening to be in front of an audience such as this. Unlike my students, you may remember things before 1990, or at least some of you do. Just to think back about how different ways of framing concepts or conflicts geographically attract our attention to different sorts of things. So Vietnam. I mean, one way of thinking about Vietnam geographically was this area divided between North and South that fit somewhere on that lower map of the Cold War. And where was it on the Cold War in terms of the Cold War order? Another way of thinking about Vietnam was in terms of a nationalist movement that came out of some kind of understanding of ethno-nationalist patterns in that part of the world, and a history of Western colonial rule that's suggested by the other 2 maps there. Those different kinds of maps, different kinds of ways of framing that particular conflict would have very different consequences in terms of how you would understand what's there, what needs attention, how we might approach policy in those areas. Or take the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979-1980. This is one of my favorites because as a geographer, I think is one of the times when I first came to realize just how geographical blinders could really allow the imagination to run wild about what might be going on. The Soviets marched into Afghanistan. The pundits got on the television who were all experts on the political machinations going on in the Kremlin, and they were theorizing about what was going on, and the suggestions were made, well, maybe this was the fulfillment of that historic drive of the Russians to get a warm water port on the Indian Ocean. I thought, gee, have they looked at a map? Maybe even they realized that Afghanistan was a landlocked country and the idea was to move into western Pakistan. But look at the coast of Pakistan. There aren't very many big ports along there. That's because it's a very shallow continental shelf. You really can't get a major harbor in there in any easy way. These kinds of puttings together of the political, the cultural, the environmental is what geography is about. It was not part of the discussion at the time. Or then take something like Bosnia, the jump forward another decade and a half, the conflict in Bosnia. Various partition plans being proposed for Bosnia. This was one of them, the Vance-Owen plan. It was based on a public domain CIA map of ethnic pluralities in Bosnia. So, if you had 3 more Serbs and Croats or Bosnian Muslims in one area, it would get colored one color. Well, this was a crashing failure, as many of you may remember, and it was pretty easy to understand why. Using some data that had been pulled together by an Austrian geographer, I came up with this map of micro and macro functional regions in Bosnia, just how people moved around and used space in the pre-Civil War times. You can see there's almost no relationship between the black lines and the proposed regions on the map. That disjunction will tell you something about why people on the ground were very unhappy with, from all sides, with the proposal that had been put forward. Talk about how geography can help us deal with issues of war and peace. I think that's a fantastic example. And then, of course, as our introducer tonight, Dr. Earle, was suggesting, most recently, the situation with Iraq, I think, is one that really cries out as an example showing why geography and geographical understanding is of some significance. I would suggest, actually, the dominant discussion of Iraq did know something about the political map. It said, here it is, and it was sort of treated as a little black box or a colored unit on the world. And it said, okay, here it is, and now we can stand up and make analogies between Iraq and Japan of the sort that Dr. Earle discussed, because that's another little unit on the map. Well, that's one way of framing Iraq. But of course, there are a lot of other things that have come to the fore now, but were not hard to see beforehand, other maps, other ways of framing Iraq that really needed to be part of the conversation. They ranged from even a map like this, which is highly simplified, ethnic maps, which were actually much more complicated, in fact, than Kurd, Sunni, Shiite, and their various policy approaches that have actually tended to solidify those as communities, because we weren't aware as much as we should have been of the cultural complexity there. There were ones about the history of Iraq that showed us how it came together and what its points of opposition and collaboration in the past have been that are clearly of significance. There are maps about the infrastructure of Iraq and its relationship to its neighbors that might have been interesting to think about in terms of even troop deployments and what areas might be vulnerable to inflows from other countries where the U.S. move into Iraq might have been less popular than it was, that didn't seem to be much a part of the mix. And of course, there were maps about the relationship between things like oil resources, as shown on the upper left-hand corner there, and the distribution of ethnic populations that was clearly needed to be part of the mix if we were going to think about how Iraq might function in a post-dictatorial environment that had more power divested to different kinds of regions. So I just used those 4 quick examples, and we can flesh them out if we'd like, as indicators of how a richer geographical understanding of conflicts throughout many of our lives is so key to trying to understand what's going on in the world and to try to approach the world in a way that can be as constructive and engaging as possible. So I'll pass it on to you, Jerry.
Well, we're in the midst of a revolution, and you're seeing it through Google Earth. A lot of people feel it through their GPS unit. There's a revolution going on that is affecting every aspect of our ordinary, everyday lives. And may I have the view graph, please? Yeah, there. There are several components to that. The real heart of what's going on is the Geographic Information System, or GIS. Google Earth is a big part of that. It's a display capability, but also a canvas on which everyone can place their geographic knowledge. The GPS unit has been around for quite some time, but it was really became public in the 90s, Google Earth more recently, remote sensing, satellite remote sensing starting in the 70s. But it's still a silent revolution because most people don't understand how much it's affecting everything. One of the aspects of it is that we've changed the nature of warfare forever. It is as significant as what happened with the invention of dynamite in 1867 or the atom bomb in 1945. If you ask national leaders what's behind it, they may say precision. They may go the extra step and say GPS, but very few of them would recognize that it's GIS that's behind it and that geography is the science behind GIS. Maybe we should have called it the G-bomb. But the GPS, GPS unit is telling that missile where it is. In order for precision bombing to work, you have to have a global, massive global GIS that has the terrain so you know which hills to miss, how to miss those hills, how to navigate through them, where are the roads, where are the people. One of the remarkable things about the initial invasion of Iraq was how few civilian casualties there were. Well, ask yourself, how did the soldiers know where not to shoot? Well, it's because there's a GIS database of population that tells them where not to shoot. Infrastructure, facilities, buildings, and then we get up to this very realistic three-dimensional portrayal of the type we see on Google Earth. This is actually one that my students in a seminar here made of Lawrence, 3D visualization. You can fly down Massachusetts Street. But the GPS unit itself, which catches most of the attention, really is just telling the missile where it is in relation to all of that. And I'm just going to take one of those examples. I mentioned the population. I worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, as Jonathan said, before I came here. And I was in charge of a project called the Landscan Global Population Project from 1997 through 2001. And our purpose in that was to develop a population database that was precise enough that it could be used for counting the people at risk in a terrorist attack. And that means there are 900 million data points on this image. And when we acquired the data for that, it was literally a ton of data. It was a pallet that weighed 2,086 pounds of CDs that we had to process in order to make that population happen. It's the most precise ever done. It's changed so many things and some things I never know the full extent of it, but just to illustrate how important that was, as soon as we had released it, I was invited to come and speak with NATO, and they took me to this place. And when you look at this place right here, what you're seeing is a parking lot with some hedgerows. I got out of the car and I looked around thinking, we must be walking a long way to the building because I didn't see a building anywhere. We go around one of those hedgerows and go down into a ramp going down under the ground, and there you go through the James Bond kind of thing and inside, and it was an underground city. And I remember sitting there as we were talking about what they were going to do with this database and how it was changing the fundamental ways that they do business. I thought, as a lowly geographer, I never thought in my life that I would touch on anything that was that important, and certainly not that a geographic database would make that much difference. Now, I'm going to go over to the side that Alec has addressed, looking at the geopolitics of what's going on right now. I sort of bridge between Brian's interest in technology and Alec's interest in geopolitics. We're hearing everyone now, including even reports that President Bush, behind closed doors, is asking people, where did we go wrong in Iraq? How did we get it so wrong? Calling experts in to ask them. But we really ought to be asking a bigger question than that. Why is it that we got things so wrong in Korea and Vietnam and Beirut and Somalia and Afghanistan? We've had more than half a century, about 60 years, of more quagmires than victories. Why is that happening? What changed? Is it the valor of our soldiers? No. They're as outstanding as always. Is it the training, equipment, or technology? No. Those are better than ever. But what about policy, strategy, foreign intelligence, geopolitics? It seems we're playing a game of blind man's bluff when we go into so many of these situations, like Mogadishu or Iraq. And that coincides with the period of the American purge of geography. And I really appreciate the fact that Jonathan alluded to that a while ago. Let's compare the first half of the century with the second half of the century. In World War I, all right, I've mentioned that Alec and I are both with the American Geographical Society. On the wall of our old headquarters on Broadway in New York, there was this set of signatures. That is the entire American delegation to negotiate peace at Versailles at the end of World War I. Why did they come to our headquarters and sign our wall? Because we were responsible for leading the inquiry, which was the intelligence analysis of foreign intelligence during World War I. Because of that, our humble organization was responsible for drafting Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Now, think about that and compare that to anything that's happening today. In World War II, 1/3 of all academic geographers moved to Washington, D.C., most of them to the OSS, but other places as well. And in all of that, one of the key people was our director, Isaiah Bowman, had been director of the American Geographical Society during World War I. In World War II, he was president of Johns Hopkins University. He is known as President Wilson's geographer and President Roosevelt's geographer. And he was one of the top 6 architects of the United Nations. He was the one who sat down with Winston Churchill and convinced him that one global organization would be better than 3 regional organizations. That's the kind of influence that geographers had in the first half of the century. But then we had this purge. And what do I mean by purge? I mean that in 1948, Harvard got rid of geography. Right after that, Stanford, Yale, Northwestern, Chicago, Columbia, Michigan. And then high school geography disappeared, almost disappeared. Thankfully, Alec is one of the people leading the charge to get it back into the schools. There's a joke in geography, what is the most common first name for a high school geography teacher? And the answer is Coach. And then in elementary school, it got muddled into this mishmash called social studies that ignores spatial thinking, which is a big part of what we do, and ignores physical geography. So we're left with a society that doesn't understand geography. Now let me show you the place of this in history. If we look back over the last 2,500 years, geography was a very well-defined, sophisticated, holistic discipline in the classical period. And then we had the great interruption of the Middle Ages, when for 1,000 years there was not even a common word for geography. And then geography thrived because of exploration, westward expansion, geopolitics, and all that stopped in 1948, 1950, and we have since then what I call the great, not so great interruption. It was not so great for those of us who had to make a living during that time. But it's coming back now because of GIS, globalization, war. War always brings attention to geography. One of the classic statements of the past is that war is God's way of teaching geography. And concerns about sustainability. So here's the picture today. Of the top 15 schools of international affairs, only 6 of them have geography departments, period. Of the top 20 private universities, only 2 have geography departments. And think about it, that's where most of those policymakers are coming from. Fortunately, in the top 20 public universities, and the University of Kansas being one that we can take some pride in there, geography is still strong, and that's become almost the refuge of geography in this later interruption. And this is what it's led to. Also, I appreciate the earlier mention of the Miss Teen USA, but she's not alone. We face a situation in which major national leaders do not understand fundamental principles of geography. There is a good, solid report from an ambassador who says that President Bush did not know 2 months before the attack that there are two sects of Islam. Now, you may want to look at that, and if you're a Democrat, look at that and say, oh, that was his gaffe. But it's so common throughout that when you look on the other side, John Murtha proposed a redeployment strategy, and his suggestion was to place it in Okinawa. And Tim Russert, it was in an interview, and Tim Russert said, well, that's a long way, isn't it? He said, oh, no, it's no distance. So we're seeing it from both sides. It is bipartisan, and it is universal.
Jerry, what could be done to remedy that deficiency that you see?
Well, we need to restore geography in all of our universities. Those are the Ivy Leagues in particular, the top private universities I've mentioned, they have to get it back. I think every president should have a geographer at his side, and I will give you one example. When the tsunami hit Southeast Asia, this takes it away from the more emotional issues about war. My wife and I, Gwen and I, were driving through Georgia. It was over Christmas holiday, and we heard on the radio that there had been an earthquake in Indonesia that had killed 11,000 people, and 6 of them were in Kenya. And I turned to her and said, if anyone died in Kenya, we'll be fortunate if that figure is less than 100,000 people. But there was no one in the White House who had that view of it. So President Bush actually got egg on his face because he said, we'll send $5 million or something like that. Later, they restored it and did increase the amount, and we looked good as a nation eventually. But we need someone right there on the spot who can answer those questions. There is a geographer of the United States. He's in the State Department, and he gives a report to the Secretary of State, and that can make it into the White House on a daily basis. But there needs to be someone there much closer as a policy advisor doing that.
Alec, when did you first realize that geography would have an impact on foreign policy?
Well, I mean, I suppose that Afghanistan example I showed you was one moment. I was just out of college. I went to one of these places that didn't have a geography department, and yet I had an unfair advantage. I grew up as the son of a geographer, so I actually knew a little bit about this, and I remember being struck at that moment. But then, in terms of my professional career, it was years later. I was just a couple of years out of graduate school, and it was around 1990. And there were a group of folks who were brought to Washington to address an interagency crowd about the post-Cold War era. And there was a guy from the State Department who was leading this workshop, and he got up and he said, you know, we realize that we've been pretty much conducting our policy, and this was from the inside of the government saying this, saying we've been pretty much conducting policy from a view of there's a map of countries, they're either for us or against us, our focus has been on the capital cities and so forth, and all of a sudden now we're beginning to think maybe we need to think more about ethnic patterns, about environmental sorts of things and so forth. And this group of academics, including they were willing to risk some young guys like me, had come there to sort of talk to them about that. I thought this is a moment where I could really see how a particular geographical framing of a problem had led to a sort of set of understandings, and how changing that could really alter how things were looked at. And you know, the story Jerry told about declining interest in geography, there's lots of ingredients to that, and lots of reasons why that happened. But I think one of those was that we had come to occupy a position of considerable strength in the world. We could seemingly reduce the world down to a fairly easy kind of situation. We all kind of, in some ways, look back on the Cold War era as disturbing as it was, is a sort of simpler time, don't we? You know, or at least we thought it was simpler, where there were simpler questions that were out there. And I think when that's the dominant mode of thinking about the world, it is easier to say, oh, we really don't have to worry too much about the messiness. We can focus on just a few of these bigger picture things. And then the key people are who can tell us about the political dynamics inside the capital cities, which of course are important, but are not the only thing we need to know something about.
Brian, what do you see Google Earth bringing to questions of war, peace, and politics?
Well, I think that the problem that actually geography has had has been about communication. And it could well be that the transition from paper map to digital actually hurt things. People in the past could draw maps. They could express themselves and feel like they were really communicating base knowledge because we didn't have as much information about the world, so it was pretty easy to present. GIS systems, as I've seen them, you know, I can't really speak to it because I haven't lived GIS the whole time, but I can speak to talking to all the people who use them. And they're complicated. Their presentations are very esoteric. And the output is either, again, a paper map, but now one that's been effectively custom printed, or it's a presentation that is hard for people to understand. And one of the things that the reaction to Google Earth has been, this is a way to simplify the presentation model so that, you know, everybody can see the message. And particularly in the President of the United States, you know, is not a technical person. And if you show him a presentation that goes over his head, it's gone. And that's true of almost everybody, right? Just to be fair. And so, keeping it simple allows him to understand it and perhaps make better decisions. I think that's really been the difference.
Now, Alec, if we went deeper into one of your examples of Iraq and applied what Brian was saying, could you tell us a little bit about geography's impact on?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, thinking about Iraq in a richer way, I mean, in a sense, it was something that I had a chance to do. I was on a college campus, like many college campuses, right around the time of the invasion. You know, there was a big forum, and so they dragged a few of us out to say a few things. And I actually decided, all right, I'm not going to take a position on what was obviously going to be the most political thing. You know, should we go in or should we not? Instead, what I was going to just use my eye as a geographer and say, well, what are a few things that really we ought to be thinking about, we ought to know about, and what might be some policy consequences of knowing those things? So this was literally about a month before, you know, before we went in. So I identified 4 or 5 things. One of them is just looking back at the way Iraq, of course, didn't exist on the map until 100 years ago, or less than 100 years ago. Realizing that, you know, Iraq was put together out of provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and its first rulers were British, and British colonial rule was the source of Iraqi nationalism. It was opposition to British colonial rule. So there was a nationalism in Iraq, and it was very much an anti-outside occupier Iraq. So I said, all right, one thing we've got to be aware of is that this is the actual glue of nationalism in Iraq. What does that imply? Well, first of all, probably that you, in a policy direction, if you're going to go in and you don't see yourself as a colonial power, as the United States didn't, then you want to send every possible signal that that's not your intent. So you certainly don't want to be building things that are looking like permanent military bases. You know, if later they ask you to do that, that's fine, but that's a clear signal that you're going to write down the British line. Second thing you might want to do would be to think very carefully about how you can use nationalism in your interest, and this would imply keeping intact some of the key nationalist institutions. Now, this is the one I think that's been most commonly recognized since then, is the mistake of disbanding the Army, but that was actually one of my recommendations a month before going in. But not just the Army. There are bureaucrats or police forces and so forth that was a key. So that would be one example. Another example was I was no military planner. I did not have access to intelligence and things of that sort, but it was pretty easy to see that going into Iraq was very likely to be treated by others in the region as another example of American hegemony and, you know, those sorts of things and the way it gets whipped up there. And there was a real danger that Iraq could become a kind of mecca for unstable elements coming into Iraq, using the instabilities there to their advantage. So I was thinking, well, if I were in a military planning situation with that in mind, I think one of my key concerns would be the borders. Not particular towns, but would be the borders, which could be porous to outsiders coming in. So, there's another policy implication. Well, again, you can see the consequences of a strategy that was different. Unfortunately, bombing incidences in Europe now, 2 years later, are from folks who came into Iraq, illicitly received training, end up in Europe. Now, I could go. Another key example was the oil versus looking at the maps of oil and ethnic distributions. It was absolutely clear to me from the beginning that even if we could keep the situation from becoming Kurd versus Sunni versus Shiite, that there was a clear issue of oil sharing, the revenue sharing among the oil industry that was going to be absolutely essential to address up front as an element which was going to give all parts of Iraq some stake in a post-Saddam Iraq. That wasn't even on the horizon for about 3 years. And it seems to me that those kinds of examples are really the kinds of things that help us see why some kind of geographical understanding of places like this are so critical to policy making.
Let me offer an even more straightforward example of what would have made a difference if Google Earth had been around. If you go back to 1990 and the 1991 war in Iraq, a geographer, Harm Deblay, a good friend and colleague of ours, was at that time the geographer on CBS. A geographer at a university inside of Iraq smuggled out to him, through a brother, smuggled out to him a map that showed Kuwait as the 19th province of Iraq. Harm immediately knew what that meant. And he went to Dante Fassel, who was chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee at the time, and showed it to him and said, are you concerned about this? And Fassel said, no, we're not. If Google Earth had been around, and that map had been out there where everybody, you included, were seeing it, and there had been a national discussion about it, the warning might have stuck. But it didn't, because it was much more limited than that. But Google Earth has that potential.
And Google Earth is also applicable to boundary disputes and border disputes. Could you tell us about that?
There's been a lot of discussion. I mean, certainly as Google Earth, which is arguably a neo-geographer, not the professional geographer sitting next to me, we've learned that the presentation of the map is a choice that you make, and geographers always have an opinion. Google in general does not, and so what we've discovered is that each time we've gotten a border set and presented it, and certain people have discovered either the name of that island between Korea and Japan, or the sea next to it, or the border of Kashmir. Each of these things has very strong nationalistic opinions, and it's very hard to find a single map that allows everybody seeing it to be correct. However, we have fought very hard to stay with a single map instead of having custom maps for different countries. In fact, India is continuing to ask for a custom presentation of the map for their own citizens, and so far we have not done that.
Alec, how would you go about advising, applying geographical information to making foreign policy decisions, or to playing a key role in those?
Well, I suppose a couple of the examples I've given, might be a bit suggestive. I think, what's key is, and ironic about the way that we present geography, memorizing a space on a map and its name, is that in some senses that's an act. If that's all you see that's interesting, that's an act of geographical ignorance. Because what's really interesting is how that space sits in relationship to other kinds of spaces, environmental spaces, ethnic spaces, cultural spaces of various kinds. So I think one of the key things to do, and this is where many of the mapping technologies that are out there offer enormous possibilities, is to allow us to look at the relationship between political spaces and the other kinds of sorts of things that are, fairly obviously of evidence, of importance. We haven't even said anything about environment much tonight, but gosh, talk about an important area. I mean, this is something that we're seeing the melting right now of the Greenland ice caps and the opening up of shipping routes in the Arctic. They're going to completely change, if this continues on, completely change the distance between places and how we move around between places. This is a radical change in terms of everything from security issues to global trade. And trying to understand what some of those things are going to look like, it seems to me, is absolutely key to this picture. One of the things that occurs to me, though, as I heard Brian talking a second ago, is I suppose you might run into some of the kinds of problems that more conventional mapping companies have run into when you name things. Because naming things, of course, sometimes means taking a side. I mean, do you call it the Sea of Japan, or if you're thinking of Korea, do you call it the East Sea? Let me show you one fun example, which is a kind of interesting reflection on all this. There is a move in the Arab world to call the Persian Gulf the Arabian Gulf. There's the example of it right there. You can imagine this is not a popular move in Iran. And in fact, if you Google this, you can come up with an image that the Iranians have put up. They say Arabian Gulf is what's on the left, and that the body of water is the Persian Gulf. And the Iranians are actually very, very good about this. They're very good about using Google in various ways. One of the top websites you can find if you put in Arabian Gulf is the Arabian Gulf does not exist in any location. Try Persian Gulf. And you can buy the Persian Gulf Forever wristband and so forth. But all this, it's a little bit indicative of one of those things that I really started out with. What does it mean to think about the Islamic world and actually forget that behind these kind of amusing examples lie some really serious issues about the ways peoples have related to each other historically and in the contemporary world that really ought to be part of our public understanding of what's going on around the world.
One of the things on the horizon that you've talked about is geo-slavery and geo-fencing, and we have, if you could give us some examples of that and define that for us.
Sure. I think it's one of the clearest examples of where this new technology is changing society in very, very fundamental ways. What I'm talking about, and let me start out with human tracking, which is the broader term, is the ability to place a GPS-based locator unit on a person and to be able then to know every step they take exactly where they are. That's being used in industry right now. One company claims that they are monitoring the locations every step of 50,000 U.S. workers. Even in that situation, you're taking away some freedom of decision-making that people once had. But now let's take more threatening uses of it, where it is actually used to control someone's motions. Control them coercively or control them surreptitiously. And my co-author in the paper, we wrote a paper called Geo Slavery, where we pointed out that society has to consider a new form of slavery characterized by location control. And my co-author in that is editor of the International Journal of Geographic Information Science. So we're talking about two long-time insiders of the GIS field warning the rest of the society that our field is producing something you need to pay attention to. And it is catching attention. There's a lot of confusion about it. A lot of people don't understand what we're talking about. But human tracking raises many societal issues. Geo-slavery is the most threatening of them all. And it, we can look in this country and say, maybe it won't happen here. But what about countries where there is already ethnic cleansing, countries where there's child slavery, honor murders, many things where this technology could make a huge difference and literally ended up being spelling the end of freedom for many people.
Brian, how could geographic information play a role in forming and creating public opinion regarding peace and politics and war?
I think that the biggest thing, and I've said it before, is to give context to discussion. And obviously the ignorance and mapping in the world has shown that a lot of people don't even have good context when they approach a problem. And the consumer, the voters, actually have an influence on what the government does. I mean, it sometimes doesn't seem that way. Sometimes it takes 4 to 8 years to change something. But if you know something about the thing and are not just taking it from the government's explanation, we've already seen that intelligence is not that great. We don't actually understand what's going on. It isn't just a geographic problem. It's a generic intelligence problem. I think that citizens back in 2003 saw that some of these decisions were not well thought out, and that there were going to be problems. Several pointed out here. More people thinking that sooner would have stopped the authorization of the war. And I think that would be the difference that we can make, is get that information to enough people, calling enough senators to do enough political voice to affect the outcome of the decision.
Alec, you've recently visited Iran. Could you tell us, from a geographer's standpoint, your perspective on Iran?
Well, there's a big question. I wish I had 2 hours on that one. If you want to go somewhere and spend a couple of weeks and not see other Americans, I highly recommend you book a trip to Iran. I went there about 3 years ago. It was actually before Ahmadinejad came in, so I'm not even sure I could have done what I did 3 years ago. But I went there as a guest of an Iranian geographer to address the Second International Congress of Geographers of the Islamic World in Tehran. And that was the formal reason for the visit, and then I actually had a couple of weeks to poke around. First of all, I have never been treated more regally in my life. I think I was given enough food to keep a small country well-stocked for a year while I was there. But, it's a fascinating place, and there are 2 or 3 things that I guess I'd just quickly say. One is, to be there is to realize both the level of political engagement of the average citizen and the disconnect between the average citizen and the ruling authorities in many ways. I mean, everybody talks politics at home. There's lots of things said about the regime in power, and lots of them are not complimentary. So that's sort of one interesting insight. A second interesting insight has to do with, back to this issue of the Islamic world and how we think about that. I gave my talk. When you go to an occasion like this, you want to start with something nice and thank your invitees and inviters and so forth. So I started out and said, it's a great honor for me to come and address a conference dealing with geography in the Islamic world. For after all, if it had not been for the geographical work and scholarship in the Islamic world in the centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire, modern geography wouldn't be what it is today, which I think was obviously very well received and so forth, and it's quite true. Afterwards, after everyone acknowledged that they thought it was really nice that I had said that, afterwards a number of folks came to me and said, or actually 3 different folks came and said, we really appreciate your pointing this out. If you really look at what was going on during that time, there were a couple of Arab geographers, but it was really the Persian geographers that were the key contributors, and then citing me with all that. Now, that's an interesting example of, sort of how. I think the third thing is really key to understanding Iran, that sort of came home to me in a very visceral way while I was there, is the really strong, there may be lots of dissension about current directions in political leadership and so forth. There is very strong sense of nationalism and a pride in culture and history in Iran. It runs incredibly deep. You speak to that and you can get a long way. You denigrate that and you get nowhere. And that is that's an incredibly powerful force. I had, again, I couldn't have done this in the modern era, but I was on, they had an interview show like this on television. I was on Iranian television for about 75 minutes. They ran the show long that night, and there were 2 of us interviewed, and we were discussing, we agreed in advance we wouldn't discuss anything acutely political about, who is in power or anything like that, but we discussed general political geographic issues in the region and beyond. And just by starting out and showing some understanding and appreciation of Iranian history, I could get away with all sorts of things. Because they obviously were aware that I had some real understanding of and concern about the people in that part of the world. It, I think, is a key lesson in terms of all kinds of diplomatic initiatives that we might be engaged in that part of the world.
If I might interject here, we've talked a lot about cultural geography, human geography. If we go back to the failed rescue attempt in the Iranian hostage, the hostage crisis back during the Carter administration, that failed because of a misunderstanding, our inability to understand the physical geography of a desert windstorm, sandstorm, dust. Not just the fact that you had to watch out for the sandstorm, but that the desert floor was dusty enough that our helicopters would kick it up. That's the sort of thing that has to be considered from a physical standpoint, and it's just as important as our cultural understanding.
And here's another thing. If you could focus on the screen for just a second with the camera. This is a project I've been involved with a couple of graduate students where we've just been taking vulnerability maps and overlaying various kinds of vulnerabilities, agricultural, water stress, and these sorts of things. And this is very preliminary at this point, but that's a map where you can see the vulnerabilities coming together, where some of the most stressed areas are going to be in the face of continuing climate change. Is that an issue of some policy significance to be looking at? You bet it is. And in fact, there's something annually held in Britain each year called the McClendon Forum, and I presented this map at the McClendon Forum last year in Britain, and it has now found its way into the British military strategic plans for the next 30 years. They really are very concerned and very interested in this kind of stuff, and I really think we need to be too.
Brian, how has Keyhole been used to cover the war in Iraq, and how could it be used in the future?
Well, it started out on CNN with the broadcasts, and I think even today CNN is a regular user of Google Earth for almost every one of their news stories that has any geospatial reference. But again, I think that the presentation of information about potential war, before it happens, is very important. And speaking of Iran, I think that's something that really needs to be done, is to go look, focus attention on the country, focus attention on the people, and not allow fast decisions to be made. And yes, there are problems there, and yes, the nuclear development is in question. But I think that we can't again move too quickly and then cause even more significant ramifications for the rest of the Middle East. And I think presenting that information, getting it in people's hands, and again, I'm voting. We have all of the policymakers and all the government people, but in the end, if the American people don't believe in it, then we won't support it. And I think the goal is to understand whether there is something to go there. Maybe we should do it, but let's have a considered response and not a behind closed doors planning session for it.
If you'd like, we'll open it up now for questions from the audience, and Jonathan will lead that.
Actually, we're going to have two of our workers coming around with handheld mics because this is being taped and beamed to Overland Park. If you could raise your hand if you want to ask a question, we're going to start with Clarissa Unger here in the front row.
What is the military significance of this change that's possible with Google Earth? I'm talking about a non-structured society where you've got jihadists being trained in India, you've got other kinds of problems. Does it help or hurt our military dominance? We have the power, but doesn't it change the equation greatly?
Let me give you an example of where a change in technology really made a difference. You look back to the Kosovo fighting in 1999, and one of the most embarrassing and awkward things that happened in that whole war was our accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy. Now, I know some people have conspiracy theories and all that. But let's put that aside and say, how could that happen systemically? How did it happen? Well, many of us had been complaining up to that point that the U.S. military up to that point had been fully committed to automated mapping, which will allow you to make the same mistake very efficiently 1,000 times in a row. But they had not committed to GIS, which would allow them to take different databases from different sources and compare those. Since that incident, they really have changed, and they're using GIS. And I think Google Earth is it's another one of those opportunities to bring data together so we have more people looking at it. And by the way, I would say that even if it was intentional, it would have been harder for the person to get by with it if others had been able to look at the data in conjunction with other databases.
It's a great question, because we are living in a time of rapid change, and I think state monopoly we know this, obviously, from seeing the events around the world of recent years, that the state as the locus of conflict and warfare is something that is the past century, not the century to come, increasingly. That requires a significant adjustment in policy, and it's a very difficult one to do. We're used to dealing with states. We know how to deal with states. We think about states. But I think much of what at least I was trying to say earlier, and I think some of my co-panelists as well, really speaks to this. We can no longer afford just to look at the map of states, because we are in such a different environment. It's not an easy one to figure out. It doesn't as easily work in terms of dominance in the ways that it worked before, and it's a very, very difficult and, I would suggest, potentially dangerous situation. But it sure puts the imperative then on going beyond worrying about capital cities and thinking in a richer way about what's happening on the ground.
Sean has a question out there. Sean?
Gentlemen, thank you all. Brian, this is for you in particular. First of all, I've been using since Keyhole became public and appreciate Earth Sky now. It's a really interesting feature that you've added. And as soon as I hit the lotto, I'll get Earth Pro. So, listening to you earlier, I think that one of the reasons that Americans aren't particularly oriented towards world geography is that we have that egocentric view or that geocentric view. And I think about that a lot of times when I open Earth, and thank you for making Lawrence the center of the Earth, but I always wonder why sometimes a user in the rest of the world doesn't get to open it up in the southern hemisphere or in another nation, or maybe we should all, when we open it, be lost somewhere and have to fly ourselves back to home. Anyway, that's a little off point, but I think that we might get out of that thinking that this round ball all revolves around this nation. I also noticed in using Google Earth that there's an internet technology gap in this country. There seems to be a GIS gap in the third world countries. The photos are a lot older. The resolution's a lot lower. I'm wondering if Google is targeting any resources towards improving that situation, and also a dynamic aspect to it. I mean, the geopolitics of all this and the environmental impacts. I love to see the updated map, but if I want to see the ecological impact of something, I want to see 20 years of aerial photos, and I know they're out there, but the only thing that I can look at is the most current map. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you for all that.
Okay, let's see what parts of that to talk about. Let's go backwards. The first part is that would it be nice to look at historical imagery? To a degree, Google has and Keyhole has the imagery that we've received over its very short lifespan. There's a large amount of historical data, but again, much of it is locked up. The government offers some of it free, but actually the majority of the rest of the world does not give their GIS data freely to professionals or to consumers. And a very painful example of this is the Ordnance Survey in the UK actually charges very extreme fees for their high quality mapping data, and nobody else actually has good data for the UK, and that has led to challenges just providing good maps there. The rest of the world, some countries do well. Developed countries, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, have excellent mapping. And we try to get as much of that data as we can. We either license it, or if it's freely available, we'll certainly take it. The third world countries, Africa, all of the countries in Africa, probably with the exception of South Africa, have very weak mapping right now. India actually has surprisingly weak digital mapping. They have paper maps of some areas, but getting a good digital map in India is challenging. One of the things that we launched at Google recently was if you look at the 50 most populous cities in India, we have road data now for all those cities, but it was not gathered from any of the standard sources. We had to create that ourselves. And we are working on it, but it's a very large project, and it actually requires some level of geographic expertise in each of the countries, because it's it's impossible for me to map any country or probably even any state outside the ones I've visited. And even then, I can do Lawrence. I can do some parts of Silicon Valley, and that's about it. Getting local knowledge applied to the map is something we're very focused on. So, yes, we're working on it. It's a huge effort. It's one that mankind has not solved yet. It's entirely been driven by business needs and political needs. When the government had a lot of money, they made great maps. If they were very nice, they shared them. If they weren't, we still don't see them. Regarding the center of the Earth. So over time, the center of the Earth has moved around a bit. With the Mac version, it moved to Chanute, Kansas, because Dan Webb, a Kansas graduate, was a Mac fiend from 1984, got the first one, and I've been working with him. I was in my projects with him, or he was in my projects, and we wrote our first projects on the Mac Write in 1984. So he did that in Chanute, and similarly in other languages in other countries, if we have localized Earth for that country, which is actually a pretty big effort, it's not just translation, but if we've done that, we have in fact moved the center to the southern hemisphere. So Australia, if you open it in Australia, the Australian version will go to pretty much Uluru, and that's where they think it is. But that's only been very recent, so probably the first 200 million were still in Kansas.
Very cool. Clarissa here on this side, and then we're going to try to go to a question from the Simons Overflow Room. Anyone with a question for Clarissa Unger? There's one.
Hello, I'm Joe Wimmer, and this is also a question for Mr. McClendon. I was curious as to the current spatial resolution used for most of Google Earth, and also how much room is there for advancement in that field, and are you restricted from the government as to what you can do?
That's a very good question. The imagery that we get from satellite, the current satellite company we use is Digital Globe. They have a 0.6 meter per pixel imager that is in fact restricted by the government. That was the bar at the time they launched it. 0.6 meters gets you the ability to resolve a car and maybe see the windshield. The majority of data in the United States, though, is now aerial, taken from airplanes, and it depends on the altitude and the quality of the camera as to how good it is. And big city centers in the United States are now down to even 3 inches per pixel, which means you can recognize the make of the car, you can see the shadow of people walking on the street. It's kind of cool, but it's very hard to get a lot of that data, because if you multiply it out, covering even the United States with 3-inch data would blow out even Google servers. In the rest of the world, it depends. Western Europe has good aerial photography, but in general, the fact that we have the Digital Globe data is a big part of why we get such good coverage. If you look at Saudi Arabia, you look at all of Africa, Darfur, we have large amounts of high-res imagery, but it's all from satellite. There's very little aerial. But technology is getting better, and now because of Google Earth and its competitors, there's been a much larger motivation to acquire it and much bigger advances in high-quality, low-cost cameras. Unfortunately, airplanes aren't getting any cheaper. But if the cameras and the sensors get better, they can fly higher and get the same resolution. and so they can cover much larger areas. And so, yes, it's going to get better. It's still very expensive. The amount of money, I mean, the Digital Globe satellite that was launched that we're using was $500 million, and the majority of that was underwritten by the government for them being a customer of that data. There continue to be additional launches and at least $500 million per. And that's beyond what we spend on Google Earth. We license a copy of that data. And that's part of the reasons why we just can't give the data to everyone, because it's not ours to give. As time passes, we'll work on our own methods of collection.
Way in the back.
Is it possible to access Global Earth on our home computers?
Absolutely. Any PC that has a good connection to the internet, and by PC I mean personal computer, which includes Macintosh and Linux, but also Windows, can download Google Earth from earth.google.com, and you can run the program and see all the things we're talking about. If your computer is not connected via broadband, or perhaps you have a very old computer, you can use maps.google.com and see the imagery that we're talking about, but many of the features, overlaying data and animating it and seeing terrain, won't be available.
Do you need special software, additional software for the normal computer?
Just the program itself. If your computer is recent in the last 2 or 3 years, that should be all. You download that program and run it, and that's all you need to do.
Okay. Question over here.
I noticed that pre-9/11 we were starting to have, right about up to that time, pretty interesting opportunities for access to public information. You could have, I know in this community we had all the property tax evaluations online through the newspaper, and you could go through and do searches and queries and integrate it with maps, and life was pretty rosy. And post 9/11 people are very worried about that kind of public information. So from the geospatial community, that's frustrating because there's applications you can't do. From the citizens, they may or may not feel their privacy is being protected. They might have wanted to use those applications too. How do you see that evolving?
When we released that global population database, there was a major discussion. It was funded by the Department of Defense, and there was a major discussion about whether it should be released to the public or not. And I ended up having to carry that argument to its final conclusion. I argued that terrorists may know, sure there's a chance that they might want to use it, but in general they already know where they want to hit, and they have other objectives in mind. The people who really need it are the first responders. And if you don't give it to them on a routine basis, then they're not going to have it, and even if you gave it to them during the emergency, they wouldn't be able to use it. So it's absolutely essential to have it out there and using it all the time. So really it goes back to the old rules about technology in the first place, is we just have to outcompete them. We have to do a better job with it, use it in positive ways, and be ready to counter whatever anyone else might want to do with it of an evil nature. That argument carried the day, and that's why it's out there in the public. And what I showed you a while ago for the entire Earth is that, I'll use a little bit of geographic terminology here. It is at 30 arc seconds resolution, which means it starts out at the equator as 1 square kilometer and gets more precise as you go toward the poles. So compare 1 square kilometer. For the U.S., we knew we could do much better because there's so much better data available here, imagery and other kinds of highway data and all sorts of things. So we produced it here at 3 arc seconds, which is about the size of a city block. And we did it for day and night. And you can think back to the incident with the World Trade Center. That was the missing information. That's exactly what they needed to know, was how many people were in the Trade Center during the day. Census tells you where you sleep at night. The U.S. Census actually says that there are 55 people in that census block, and it's a large census block, about 16 acres. So we produced something that now is much more precise, and it has not been released yet. We understand it will be released, but it has not been released yet.
See, Sean has someone in the back.
If the president asked you for advice about our immigration policy, what would you tell him?
Well, I do have one answer. I would separate the issue of worker permits from the issue of citizenship.
That's a short meeting. Anybody else want to crack at that? We have time for one more question, and Clarissa's right here by the door.
This is off the subject a little bit, but since you're geographers, I have seen some maps in the past showing different state configuration in this country. You know, a big area around Denver, around Kansas City, and as you well know, or you may not know, that at one time I think the panhandle of Nebraska was interested in seceding from Nebraska, and also we had some counties in western Kansas that wanted to join the panhandle down in Oklahoma and Texas. And then there are some other areas too around the country. Do you ever see our reconfiguring our states in this country with some of your mapping?
Well, northern and southern California is another issue that's come up. Or then there's the graffiti in the men's room in my building that says U.S. out of Oregon. But no, I mean, but it's an interesting question in that you know, Jerry earlier was giving the example of the map that showed Kuwait as you know, as part of Iraq. Maps are political statements in many ways. We think of maps as objective renderings of the world, but every map involves decisions about what's going to be shown and what's not, what's highlighted and what's not. And you can go into one of the main museums in Guatemala City and you see a big relief map of Guatemala, and you'll look at that first and you'll scratch your head. I shouldn't say this, maybe they've changed in the last 10 years, but when I was last down there, you look at it, and it doesn't look quite like Guatemala, and you suddenly realize that Guatemala's taken over Belize, or that Belize is part of Guatemala, because they historically regard Belize as you know, as part of Guatemala. So it's the same kind of thing. It provides some pretty interesting insights into what different motives or objectives, or at least senses of historical wrong might be. And in fact, when I was in Washington earlier this summer, and I'm still regretting I don't have anything intelligent to say about immigration, but I was talking about boundary conflicts between different countries, and I said, you know, something as simple as getting the most aggressive expression of what a country sees as its boundaries on maps and putting all those together is actually an enormously insightful map about where you're going to see instabilities between countries around the world.
Well, I don't expect to see any changes here in the U.S., but a lot of my research deals with landmines. We are funded here at the University of Kansas by the Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining. In other words, the organization associated with the United Nations that helps all of the countries around the world that are trying to get rid of their landmines. And a lot of the country we go to, the mines are there because of this border pressure. Probably, how many people in here knew there was a war between Ecuador and Peru in 1995? Very few. There was, and that's why the landmines are there. And we go to this place. We had to go fly over the Andes to a small town, go 100 miles on roads that jostle you so much your neck hurt for several days, go down by river for several miles, and then walk into this border several miles. And they cared enough about that border to have a war over it. It was unresolved from colonial days. Another case is the border of Chile and Bolivia. There are landmines there in northern Chile because of a long-standing attempt, desire of Bolivia to get an outlet to the sea, unlike the Russian example that Alec offered earlier. And in that case, the mines were put into place, and a big rainstorm came along, and now they're just exposed throughout this whole ravine, and they go out on the coast and wash down the beaches. That's the sort of thing we're facing around in other places around the world because people care so much about borders that certainly in the case of the Cenepa War in Ecuador, you would never think that that was important enough to fight over.
Wow, with that, I will draw your attention, if you don't mind, to two things that were on your seats when you came in. One of them is a brochure urging you to become a friend of the Dole Institute. If you like programming like this, please help us bring it to you more frequently, if you have the cash. And the other thing is our program, and on the back, I just want to alert you to two things. This coming Wednesday, September 26th, we have a KU PhD student in political science who is just back from Iraq and is going to give a presentation on observations from Iraq, implications for the future, closely penned to the Iraqi government that we hear so much about. And then the last thing, the Dole Leadership Prize is going to be presented in the Leeds Center on October 21st. It's a Sunday night at 7:30, and there will be a big announcement about that next week. And with that, I want to thank Brian McClendon, Alec Murphy, Jerry Dobson, and Greg Hurd for a wonderful program. Thank you.